morning, Randy, and
Hi, Antoine.
very happy to have you for this series of podcasts. And you will be the first one because, you're probably the first person I met in my EOR career in New Mexico.
Well,
And
thanks for having me. Yeah.
no, so the idea for this one would be probably to discuss a little bit about personal background and technical expertise, and maybe the future of EOR. So that's going to be the idea. And anything you are happy to share, of course, with the community and help, I would say, improves everyone's knowledge and accelerate anything linked to EOR would be more than welcome. So maybe let's start with some personal background. So, well, who are you and where are you from? What's your background? Which school? And can you tell us a bit more about the beginnings and how you came to work in EOR?
Yeah. I guess grew up in Montana, northern USA. Went to school and became a chemical engineer in Montana, and then went to Wisconsin for a PhD in chemical engineering. And always liked math and chemistry and physics, that sort of thing. So, I guess everybody else who becomes an engineer, that's pretty common. I guess one little twist when I was in school, coming out of school, I really had no particular bias about going into the oil industry. When I came out, it just turned out that the oil industry was offering by far and away the best salaries. So that was pretty shallow, I guess, but that was the inspiration for it.
What was the time? So, what year was that?
I got my PhD in 1978, so that's a long time ago.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so you are saying that you had no particular bias into choosing the oil and gas industry. It's because, I mean, you said math, physics, and the rest. So why oil and gas and not, I don't know, space industry or anything else?
Yeah, I guess, like I say, to be honest, the number one thing at that time, the oil industry really wanted people, and they just offered by far the best salaries. I guess, honestly, going into graduate school, I suppose I had a fantasy about going into catalysis, but you know, things change. I guess that's kind of one of the messages for everybody is you got to be a little versatile.
And
I guess I
so, yeah, please.
I guess I did like in the oil industry. A couple of people had gone, friends had gone there the year before, and they were emphasizing just the diversity of people and the diversity of ideas from all different areas and the possibility of travel. That was exciting to me at the time too. So those were key features.
So
Yeah.
what was the first company you worked with or worked for?
Exxon. So it was called Exxon Production Research Company in Houston at that time.
And so
Yeah.
what was your, I would say, daily routine or job?
Well, what's interesting is when I did my PhD, it was on um, fast kinetics of surfactant aggregation, and really didn't know anything about polymers. But when I got to Exxon, they said we need a polymer flooder, so you're going to be a polymer flooder.
Mm.
So I really started from scratch there. So that was something I think it happens a lot in the oil industry. You fill their needs as opposed to necessarily being relying on your particular background. So that's what
Yeah.
happened to me.
And so
Yeah.
you mentioned polymers. What was the first oil field you worked on at the time?
Wilmington, out in Southern California, not too far from Long Beach. At that time, oil prices were really high, and Exxon had lots of money. And Wilmington is a very old field, but a very large field, and they were trying to figure out if EOR could be workable there, polymer flooding in particular. And they gave me a lot of freedom to just basically go out there and try things with polymer flooding. So that was a lot of fun. I did enjoy that a lot.
And so, can you tell us a bit more about the field characteristics? How did you approach that, and what did you learn? What came out of this project?
Um, well, I guess I certainly learned um, the natural tension between the field engineers there who are really focused on making money and trying to learn something from doing a project. So you have to kind of learn the compromises there. This was an old field. I think it had been producing probably since the 1930s or so. Very large field, very thick field. Oil viscosity moderately high. I can't remember the exact number there, but probably a good 100 centipoise, maybe more than that. And they had one zone I know that was they called a tar zone that was even seemed to be out of reach at all. We didn't even think about that one, but it had been water flooded for quite some time. And we were looking for a good polymer to put in. It was all really thinking about polyacrylamides at that time, but we settled on a particular vendor and learned a lot about dissolving the polymer and injecting it. Another fun thing was use of pressure transient analysis out there. That was actually a good field to learn pressure transient analysis because it was fairly homogeneous, at least in the area where I was focused. Um, so the pressure transient analysis worked, whereas in a lot of cases, the interpretation is so complicated because of the geology that you have. But there it was nice. It seemed to fit very well. So that was good.
And so you said that basically you knew nothing about polymers. Did you have a mentor in your career or this at that time that helped you learn faster or help you with
Yeah. Yeah, I had three incredibly nice people. John Merker, who was a well-known polymer expert at that time. Eric Sandvik, who was really more of a thermo guy, but he was kind of the key guy in charge of me, at least at first when I got there. And Walt Gale, who was a super surfactant flooding expert, just an incredibly smart guy. All three of these guys were very, very nice and were really nice to me. So,
So it
you
was
know,
what sharing their knowledge, experience, taking you by the hand, bringing you to the field. How did it work out?
no, it was more of just giving me the flexibility to say, okay, here's some thoughts and general guidance, but it's up to you, go for it, So it wasn't a lot of, incredibly micromanaging or it was the opposite of that. It was really more giving me the freedom and saying, here's kind of our goals and do the best you can with it. So that was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. They put a lot of trust in me, and it was really good. So,
And so how long did you stay with Exxon, and what was the next step?
so 7.5 years. I think probably anybody who works for an oil company finds out that when times are good and they've got a lot of money, you get a lot of freedom and you get a lot of opportunity. And when things turn down, they really pull back and things get a lot more bureaucratic and a lot more restricted. And the other thing about Exxon was, and probably a lot of the big oil companies, they were, although they wouldn't say it, but they're really much more structured and maybe what some people would call bureaucratic than other organizations. So um, that yeah, I mean, that's really good if you're just starting out because you maybe need that structure, but after you've been there for a while, you maybe need a little more freedom and want to have the ability to call your own shots and type of thing. So I think that was a really big factor for me. Was I really just needed to had a lot of ideas, and Exxon, their focus really wasn't so much on polymer flooding. Initially, it was as support for surfactant flooding, but they didn't really see themselves as really going big time into the polymer flooding area. And so I liked the idea of, maybe 99.9% of the world didn't care at all about what I was doing, but a very small fraction thought it was kind of important, and I would like more of an opportunity to share it with them. So that's why the university environment was a little more attractive. So I went to New Mexico Tech in 1987. Um, and
So what were the first research topics at the time? And can you tell us about the journey from 1997 to 2024, basically?
Yeah, so 1987. And so as I recall at the time, what they basically told me was, we got good news and bad news for you. The good news, you can do anything you want, and the bad news is you got to raise the money to pay for it. And yeah, honestly, I didn't really think I'd last more than a year or two at something like that. But it was fun doing it because I had some real biases from my time at Exxon on what really needed to be done with polymer flooding and also with gel treatments. I mean, Exxon wasn't really all that much into gel treatments, but they gave that to me as a topic, that I was supposed to be responsible for there. So I had some strong biases about things that needed to be done in those two fields. Also at that time, this is 85, 86, or 86, 87 type of time frame, and oil prices had dropped, and all of the oil companies were just killing off all of their chemical flooding research and projects, et cetera, because oil prices were low, and their logic was, that the price of the chemicals would always be tied directly to the price of oil, so it was never going to go anywhere. So they got discouraged with that. And so at the time, I thought it was blatantly obvious that nobody was interested in polymer flooding. It went from super high interest before 1986 to zero interest, but there was a high interest in water shutoff and the use of these gels, and I had some real biases about how to improve that. So that was my focus when I got to New Mexico Tech in Socorro, New Mexico. And it was a very definitive change. I do remember, when I got there, like about the first few weeks, went to my boss and said, "Look, here's some guys I want to talk to. Is that okay? I mean, these are outside the company, and I want to contact them." And I remember he looks at me and says, "I don't care. Get the hell out of my office. Go do what you want," which was, just a super change from Exxon, where you had to have, real consideration, approval for talking to anybody outside of the organization. So that was really, a nice thing. I always remember from that point on, I didn't bug him about that. I just went and did what I wanted, which was really cool. And I really did enjoy that.
So maybe just before we discuss a bit more generally, you mentioned you had strong biases about what you wanted to improve in water shutoff and gels. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit what you
Yeah, so at the time, there were two really common things said in that area, and one of them was, well, these gels or gelants, they just magically only go into the high permeability watered out zones, and they don't go into the oil zones at all. And I mean, that's a blatant violation of Darcy's law, right? You know that's not going to happen. And yeah, it's going to go into the most permeable pathway, but some of it's going to go into the less permeable pathway. And the critical question is, you know, your goal is to improve the profile, meaning you want to ultimately change it from most of the, you know, a high fraction of the flow going into the most permeable pathway, the less permeable pathways that presumably have more oil. But the question is, you know, if you don't do anything to control, if you just bullhead this in and not control where it's going, the gellants are going to go everywhere to some extent. And the key question is, how much does it damage the less permeable pathways? And does it really ultimately result in an improvement in profile? And there are circumstances where it will and circumstances where it won't. The other thing is there was a very strong emphasis at that time or de-emphasis on fractures. You know, I mean, there were a lot of people who just didn't believe in the importance of fractures. And it seemed obvious to me that the gel treatments had far, far, far greater potential for treating fracture type of problems than matrix type of problems, especially if you weren't going to zone isolate or control where your fluids were going to go. So I did a lot of work, and that was the whole focus of, you know, especially the early part of that time period from, let's say, 87 to about 2000 was trying to convince the industry that treating fracture type problems had a lot greater potential than treating matrix type of problems. And I got an incredible amount of resistance. I mean, it was a pretty hard fight to do that. And there's still people today that fight that. So, yeah.
And so, why do you think? Because I mean, now, and this is probably some topics we will discuss in other videos, but why do you think that, despite the potential of applying well-designed and diagnosed conformance and water stuff treatments, the
Yeah.
industry is
So,
still struggling to basically, cut the water?
yeah. So one of the realizations that kind of sunk in slowly to me is, you know, people are willing to throw money at problems if they think they're going to get more oil out of it. But if the issue is just water production and all you're going to do is reduce water production, water is costing you money. And, you know, you always have a choice. You could just say, well, I'll get a bigger pump and keep pumping the water. And so most people were not willing to throw a lot of money at um, a water production problem, which means more specifically, one of the key messages that would seem fairly obvious early, and but still we had to fight for a long time was, you know, there's a lot of different reasons why you might be producing too much water, and if you don't spend a little bit of time and effort diagnosing what that problem is, and you just try to dump in a solution like some particular magic gel, your chances of success are pretty darn low, right? Because you're not necessarily attacking the right problem. So we had a high emphasis on trying to solve the problem, but, you know, or trying to identify the problem before you solve it. And most people, you know, the problem a lot of times, of course, is diagnosis. Any kind of operation or new tool that you go out there to do a diagnosis with is going to cost you some money. And like I said, people don't want to spend money on water. So we had to try to develop a strategy to say, all right, what can we do? We know people don't want to spend money, but we still know it's really important to diagnose a problem. So we came up with a strategy for trying to identify the problem with minimal expense and do it in the most cost-effective way that you can, and try to focus what problems you have a good chance of solving and what problems, even if you could diagnose it, you're probably not going to be able to solve it. So that we had a fair effort focused on that.
Well, we will discuss and dive probably into a couple more videos, because it's very interesting topics. And if there is a way also to help, I would say, people first get better diagnostics to know where does the water come from, then we will have probably some very nice discussions. Maybe looking back with Exxon and university. So what's been the most difficult, challenging, or interesting project? So let's maybe first the most challenging and difficult, and then the most interesting. And probably they are linked, but if you had to start with one.
Well, I'll start with the one that was challenging. I think everyone has heard of something called disproportionate permeability reduction by gels, or some people call it relative permeability modification. And the idea is that a polymer or a gel, especially a gel, might be able to reduce the permeability to water a lot more than it reduces permeability to oil. And the attraction, of course, is especially in, well, really exclusively in production wells. The nice thing there is, in theory, you could just dump this stuff in, and if you had a complex formation where you were completed in a lot of different zones, some of them producing oil, some of them producing water, it would be nice to shut off that water and not shut off the oil so much. And we did have known for quite a long time that people have seen that some of these materials would reduce permeability to water a lot more than they would reduce permeability to oil. Some of the more aggressive vendors would, say something that was never true, which was they would shut off the water and not have any effect on the oil. And of course, that was never true. You always got some permeability reduction to oil. And the trick, of course, was to maximize that difference, to maximize your permeability reduction to water and minimize your permeability reduction to oil. But the thing was, nobody really understood why that occurred. Okay, so I mean, there were, a number of different explanations that vendors threw out there, but they had no basis for it. They were just total black magic explanations that didn't have any basis in reality at all. So well, the bottom line is we spent about 15 years trying to figure that out. And that was a very challenging and difficult problem. We did many, many different kinds of experiments trying to figure out why that was happening. And it turned out ultimately the way we solved it, and the most productive way, was we hooked up with Brent Lindquist and Masha Pradanovic. They were at Stony Brook, New York University, Stony Brook there. And they were real experts in analysis of X-ray computed microtomography. And we had access to a unit up in Brookhaven at the time. So we actually did X-ray computed microtomography, and we pretty much figured out why that was happening for the most reproducible of these systems and so that was quite difficult, quite interesting to do, but it was quite an effort. Like I say, it took us 15 years to figure that out.
So would it be also the most interesting, or is there a topic that you think has been easy or interesting?
I have to admit, everything I've worked on has been really fascinating. Some of them are certainly appreciated by others a lot more. Anything dealing with water shutoff, not very much of that was really appreciated, even though I think we did a great deal of work, like the disproportionate permeability reduction. Again, because it's shutting off water, that's not a high impact thing. The the criteria, we had a strategy for attacking excess water production problems. There was a lot of interest in that and continues to be a lot of interest in that. But most of the other experimental things that we did, even though I think there's some real advances made there, the interest has not been terribly high by others. The highest interest has been in the polymer flooding area where people see oil, and so they place a higher value on that, and they place a higher value on research results associated with that.
So what's a
Yeah.
good transition, because since you've been working in water shutoff, but also a lot on polymer flooding, so can you tell a little bit what you think have been the most interesting or the breakthrough in the last maybe 10 or 20 years? So what has changed since the time you joined Exxon in 1988, or when you left Exxon in 1986 or 7?
So, and focusing on what I see are the big advances of polymer flooding. So up until 2000, really nobody was interested in polymer flooding except for Dacheng. And of course, they were an exception for starting their project. But, and looking back over that time polymer flooding has really advanced, and there's been a lot of really good things that have been done. If I look at what are the most significant advances and why it has really gone off, I'd say several of the key things I didn't really have anything to do with, but I'd say that at the top of the list, you have to say, believe it or not, polyacrylamide prices are actually lower now than they were in 1980. And that is a major, major factor for why polymer flooding, people are interested in it now. So that's kind of a no-brainer. If what you inject is a lot cheaper than what you're going to get out, the oil, then that increases the interest in it. So, you got to get a lot of credit to the polymer manufacturers for finding ways to keep those prices low. That's a super major thing. A second really important thing that was very instrumental, like at Pelican Lake, was the realization that we could use horizontal wells to go after much more viscous oils than we thought with vertical wells. So that's a major advance and has tremendous potential. Something that's maybe a bit newer, we in the polymer flooding area, we've always been interested naturally in finding more cost-effective polymers. So a long time people were interested in xanthans, chloroglucan, lots of other things like that. But I mean, the key is, number one, you got to make it at an affordable price. And number two, it's got to be available in the quantities that you need for large scale application. And again, you got to go to the polymer manufacturers. This hasn't really taken off yet, but there's certainly a lot of interest in it. Could take off is this development of ATBS copolymers, and especially the 100% ATBS version of this stuff. Of course, that substantially improves stability, and we've shown, one of our developments is we've demonstrated that the 100% ATBS version of this polymer is very workable at temperatures up to 120 degrees centigrade, which, for a long time, some really good work done in the 80s said we could make polyacrylamide work nicely at 60 degrees centigrade and below, maybe up to 70 degrees centigrade, but there's kind of a red flag once you get to 70. And I think what we're seeing in the industry is 70 is a little too hot for the normal polyacrylamides that we have, if you have normal amounts of calcium and magnesium in your waters. But being able to use the ATBS polymer, although it's certainly a little more expensive, it has opened the door so we could go in any brine, any salinity, any divalent ion content up to 120 degrees centigrade tremendous potential there. And another thing about the ATBS that we've learned is it very definitely seems, especially for clastic type of materials, seems to have a significantly lower retention. Putting in just a little bit of ATBS can significantly lower the retention compared with normal polyacrylamide. I don't know that we have that defined necessarily very well for carbonates, where there's a tremendous interest in this, but for clastics, that could be of very high importance. So those are three, again, that I didn't really have much at all to do with, but they're major advances. The one area that I think is a major advance and that people have not picked up on yet is controlled use of fractures. Okay, I'm absolutely convinced any vertical polymer injection well, it's got something that looks like a fracture in it, and that's critical for getting the injectivity that you see.
But do you think it's because people know but are scared about even mentioning the word fracture in some countries because of regulation, or just because no one wants to hear about them? Or what do you think is the reason behind?
Absolutely. That's got to be the number one reason. Back a long time ago, certainly people know if you don't control those fractures, you don't know where they go, they can do some real damage. That's absolutely true. And that's naturally seeped into the regulations, and of course people are very afraid of that. So that's been certainly a very important fight. I mean, usually, well, I guess there's a big wide range, but the regulators are usually amenable to logic, right? I mean, if you can make a good case for, okay, here's why I want to do this, if you've got fairly reasonable people and intelligent people, they'll be able to do that. But a lot of people, a lot of engineers don't even want to challenge regulators or talk with them at all. They're just seen as the enemy on things. So that is, you're right on target, that is the big reason. But the reality is, like I say, every single vertical polymer injection well I'm aware of and have looked at, regardless of what they say, you look at their data, it becomes very obvious that there has to be a fracture-like feature there in vertical wells, not horizontal wells necessarily, but vertical wells. And rather than just hiding your head in the sand and pretending they're not there, you might just as well realize they are, and then find out how to make them work for you as opposed to work against you. So that's a major deficiency that I guess I've been fighting for a while, and I think we could make some major advances with that.
But for instance, would it be reasonable to say that even in vertical wells, perforation is the I would say is a fracture, is like the a fracture in creation, because the way basically you shoot guns, and the orifice you create, and the distance inside the reservoir is already probably the path towards creating, at some point when you switch, for instance, to water, from water to polymer, to enhance the size of this perforation, which becomes or is a pseudo fracture, and that will extend with time.
Well, so for a long time, it was generally accepted that perforations are not going to go very far, right? And it certainly depends on the type of rock that you're dealing with. But if it's hard rock, it goes a certain distance. It's rare to see perforations going any more than, in most extreme cases, maybe 18 inches, probably a lot less than that. Now, there are certainly these little drilling outfits that have, individual small diameter drills that go out maybe 35 feet. I've even heard claims up significantly farther than that, although those are controversial claims, especially. And unconsolidated formations. But the bottom line when you look at those is they're not far enough and they don't have a high enough flow capacity to justify what we're seeing with actual injectivities of polymers in vertical wells. The only way you can justify that is something that looks like a fracture. If it's not a fracture, it's a fracture-like feature. And these things go out at least 10 feet from the well bore, often significantly more than that. But so these are not perforation type of distances. Perforation type of distances are, like I say, 18 inches or less. Fractures or fracture-like features, it's pretty hard pressed to find something that would be less than 10 feet. So it'd be in that kind. So they're a different animal in my mind. And the other thing about fractures is a lot of times we don't, well, most times we don't really have control over the direction they want to go. I mean, your local stress fields determine that, right? So that's Mother Nature says your fractures or fracture-like features are going to go this way. And that's a really important concept for polymer flooding because you really need to know that information. In any polymer flood, you're always in a polymer flood, you're going to be pushing the limits of injectivity. You're going to want to be trying to put that in as fast as you can. And, whether you want to believe it or not, that's ends up creating something that looks like a fracture. And if you set your pattern so that you take advantage of the direction those fractures want to grow, you can do a whole lot better than if you just ignore that and say, well, I'm going to use a 5-spot pattern or, whatever I was using for a water flood. That's a major set of advantages that some people have learned and probably most people haven't. So that's a big area of advance for us.
And so when you, generally speaking, what are the main challenges for polymer flooding implementation we could split sandstones and carbonates, but maybe there are challenges which are common to both. So,
well, so here I'm going to deviate with what a lot of people would say. I mean, there's standard things that some people would say, but I'm going to focus on the things that they need to be focusing on, and that very often they don't. Okay, so the first thing is really conveying to operators what is important, and there's some things that maybe everybody agrees on, but the first thing again I'm going to say for a polymer flood is it is really important if you're considering that for your field. Think about what direction fractures or fracture-like features, or what some people call matrix bypass events, what direction do those naturally want to grow? And you've already got information from your field that there seems to be a permeability trend, that flow seems to go more this way than that way. And that's critical information for a polymer flood, again, because those are probably due to fractures or fracture-like features, and you want to take advantage of those in a polymer flood. So that's number one. Number two, I would say minimizing dissolved oxygen in the flow stream. A lot of people approach a polymer flood and just say, well, I got this to work with a water flood, so why do I worry about oxygen? It's just gonna, and if you're lucky enough to have a low temperature and you're using a source water to make up your polymer that has absolutely no dissolved iron in it, you can, a lot of people have gotten away with being able to use that. But if you're using any kind of water that has any kind of iron in it, or if your reservoir temperature is above 50 degrees centigrade, you're just crazy. You're losing money like crazy if you don't keep your oxygen in your flow stream as low as you possibly can. And what a lot of people realize, that's a lot easier to do than you might think. And it doesn't cost as much as you might think. So a lot of people lose track of that. That's an important thing they need to keep a track of. A third thing is realizing the thermal hydrolysis limits of polyacrylamide. If your reservoir temperature is, let's say, 70 degrees centigrade, it's natural for you to say, well, I know polyacrylamide's cheaper than something that puts a little bit of ATBS in it. So I'm going to just, go for the cheaper way. And I think we're starting to see 70 degrees centigrade's a little too hot for polyacrylamide, that we need to have some kind of ATBS in there. So, having a little bit of understanding of what the limits of polyacrylamide are and where you just need to starting to transition to ATBS is really important. Realizing the importance of mobility ratio and viscous fingering. We have a group of people out there who are just utterly ignoring that, and those are critical things. I mean, just basic reservoir engineering, we've known for 70 years that mobility ratio is important in displacements. And for some people to just throw that out the window is a real mistake.
So which stage? So is it, you were mentioning viscous fingering. So is it the creation of fingers during the water flood? Is it
Yeah, so that
the
impacts how big of polymer bank you inject. Okay, so I mean, everybody wants to minimize their costs for polymer and to maximize their profits. And what you got to realize in a polymer flood is you need to have a relatively large polymer bank. Let's say 50% pore volume or greater. If you decide, the minute you decide to switch from polymer injection to water injection. I mean, that's economically a very high temptation to want to do that. But everything we've seen says once you do that, that water is going to form viscous fingers, or what some people might try to call channels, as directly as it can through the polymer bank, almost exclusively in the most permeable pathway. So that basically says, your whole idea with a polymer flood is you want to be sweeping oil out of the less permeable pathways. The minute you start water injection, that water is going to just super focus on the most permeable pathway. So that is the key technical reason why you need to be injecting the largest polymer bank that you can. And I know it's tempting to try to use pseudo-economic arguments to justify ignoring mobility ratio concepts and ignoring viscous fingering, but you're going to get into trouble that way. It's inevitable. Yeah.
So you mentioned in several of your papers the theoretical calculations to define what should be the theoretical optimum viscosity for injecting based both on mobility ratio and heterogeneity contrast. And you also mentioned that there might be in some cases some pressure barrier. So can you elaborate about, in the end, what could be something decent to consider for injected viscosity?
Oh, well, let me go to the end of your message first, or question first. The first thing is to try to think of what would we get to unit mobility displacement. As you alluded to, there are circumstances why you might want to go to a mobility ratio even below 1, but there might be a penalty for doing that in the form of a permeability or a pressure barrier that might develop. But since most people are super focused on economics, let me focus on that mobility ratio of 1 thing, because that's where a lot of people right now are really fighting. Like I say, they're saying, well, a mobility ratio of 30 is okay. And you're right, a mobility ratio of 30 is better than a mobility ratio of 300. But if your mobility ratio is really 30, it says there's a lot of room for improvement. And if you think economic arguments are stopping you, you're not looking at your economics right. And a big part of this is really understanding what your real relative permeabilities are. Now, I understand if you've got a viscous oil, it's not a really easy thing to get what the real mobility, relative permeability curves are. But we have developed, and I'll mention the paper, it's SBE paper 190.321, a methodology, a relatively straightforward methodology for finding with core floods what the optimum polymer viscosity or concentration ought to be. Like at Cactus Lake, we did this. It's a 1600 centipoise oil. And what we found was a 25 centipoise polymer will do a really good job, just as well as a 50 centipoise or a 200 centipoise polymer. That 25 centipoise is the right thing to inject. And that told us that our actual endpoint relative permeability to water was like 0.03, right? So it's most people will think, well, my endpoint mobility relative permeability is 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3. I mean, you get a lot of people saying that, and they just kind of pull that out of the air based on who knows what. But if you actually go through this procedure, you can find in some of these heavy oils that the right number really is 25 centipoise, and that your endpoint relative permeability to water is like 0.03, something like that. But you have to do the experiment. And I do know, a lot of people will, again, maybe using economic arguments, saying, I don't want to bother getting relative permeabilities, or I don't want to bother spending the money to do an experiment like this. But it's critical for determining what's the right concentration to use for your particular application. So there's a high value in that. So
you mentioned challenges about the viscosity injected, and also, of course, the fracture. Is there anything else in the common challenges people are, I would say, either overlooking or something they are too much focused on?
yeah. So to summarize, if I had to just pick two on if they're going to do a design of a polymer flood going in, I'd say number one, more than anything, spend some time trying to figure out the direction that fractures or fracture-like features want to grow, because that's critical for determining your well placement. And then that'll have a super critical effect on how quickly polymer breaks through, right? You don't want a polymer to break through. You want it to stay in. And if your fracture-like features are channeling the polymer directly from an injection well to the production well, that's not productive for you. So that's number one. And then a lot of people are not doing that, and they need to be doing that. And the second thing I would say is, yeah, I know it, operators especially don't like to do lab work, and they want to stay away from that. But it really is important for you to kind of find the optimum polymer concentration or viscosity to inject. And it's a mistake to just say, well, okay, Dacheng used this and Pelican Lake used that and Milne Point used this, so what the heck, I'm going to use that. It's better to, like I say, do these experiments, like I say, like in 190 SPE 190.321, and find out what's right for you. And then you don't have to be worrying about bizarre arguments and fighting what we've known for 70 years in the real petroleum literature. So I put those two at the top of things that are overlooked and you need to be doing. Things I'd say that are over attended to, filter tests. Boy, I spent a lot of time on filter tests since 1980, and those are way overblown. Okay, so filter tests are wonderful as a quality control, a qualitative quality control measure to make sure that the polymer that you get in the field is meeting a certain specification. I mean, you got to do it, but trying to make anything more out of it than that, you're just wasting your time, all right, in my mind. So, some people do other things with it, and I applaud them, but to try to push that too far, which too many people have done, is kind of silly. And the other thing is reduction of SOR by polymers. In truth, we've had a lot of fight over that in the literature, and yeah, I suppose probably most real operators have just ignored it. Dacheng has paid a lot of attention to it, but most everyone else hasn't really paid a lot of attention to it. But um, Mader Azad in Saudi Arabia is going to coming out with a paper here in October. And what he did was he went through a lot, really, most of the big uh, polymer floods, Dacheng, Pelican Lake, all kinds of them throughout the big ones that are in the literature, and done calculations on, what fraction of the reservoir has a condition such that the velocity would be above the point where you could get viscoelastic behavior to mobilize oil. And universally in all of these, he's finding that, it's a very small fraction of the reservoir where shear thickening or viscoelastic behavior is going to be great enough to give you any kind of significant effect.
Which is probably near wellbore and where also the oil saturation is already quite low, I suppose.
Exactly. You already flushed the heck out of it. So, there's not really much of a target there to go after. So, I suppose you could say that's something that we've maybe spent too much time on as researchers. Like I say, I think the operators really haven't worried about it all that much. But yeah.
Well, I think we'll have a specific discussion on that because I like also to pick your brain on a few things that I've been observing in the world, but it's going to be for next time. What challenges are remaining, do you think, today? So what's is hindering, I would say, everyone from moving? I mean, real challenges, things that should be solved and that could really improve everything in polymer floods, the economics, the recoveries, etc.
So there's a lot of things that we need um, to be going after, like does an aquifer, how much, we know an aquifer or a gas cap can compromise a polymer flood because you get polymer going into those zones and basically being wasted. But how much does an aquifer or a gas cap compromise a polymer flood? Under what circumstances does it compromise things? And what can you do to get around that? I know Shell is doing some good work on that, and some other people have been too. Another one, surprisingly, is should a water flood precede a polymer flood? You would think we would have the answer to that a long time ago, but really we don't. I mean, we've got some really good evidence at Pelican Lake, at Milne Point, at some other places that just we observe when we do side-by-side comparisons that injecting the polymer without any water flood ahead of it does, in many cases, definitively seem to be giving us better performance than trying to do a water flood first. Skauge and Zorby made some really good arguments and did some really good imaging work to show that if you do a water flood first, and these viscous fingers can establish pathways that can actually be good pathways when you start the polymer flood that the oil will push through. So, that's an opposite argument for saying maybe there is a benefit to a polymer flood for doing a water flood first. Your water flooding first too gives you reservoir characterization you wouldn't have if you just went right out and did a polymer flood first. So that's something a lot more, we don't have it.
Do you think because so where that's a very interesting question. Probably we can follow up on the next session. But so water basically is one centipoise, and yeah, that's an argument that I've heard a long time ago, which is, well, we need water injection to better understand the reservoir.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, what difference does it make going from 1 centipoise to 5 centipoise, for instance? How does it or how when do we start losing information with any different fluid than water, and why? That would be my question.
So I don't necessarily have the answer to that, although let me say that I do make the point, and I've emphasized it, knowing the direction that fracture-like features want to grow is critically important in a polymer flood. And if you just walk into a field with no information, and I've done primary production and that's it, and then you start injection, maybe you don't know anything about where the direction those fractures want to grow. So if you start by injecting an expensive polymer and getting its breakthrough, um, that it's a lot cheaper to find that information with water. You could say that. And again, I'm not saying I know the right answer to this question of should a polymer flood be done first or not. It's an area I'd say more work needs to be done, and there's arguments on both sides of it.
And coming back to the lab experiments creating the viscous fingers, maybe we can also discuss a bit more thoroughly next time. But I have another question. Maybe, or is there maybe lab artifacts in the way we do run our core floods? What I mean is, and even myself, when I did a lot in my young career, all the core floods I've run were at fixed injection rate. And it's like the viscoelasticity and decrease in oil saturation. All the tests I know were run at fixed injection rate, which means you put a constraint on the way you do the analysis, which doesn't exist really at reservoir conditions, except again in the near wellbore area, where basically you are constraining the flow into maybe a smaller surface, a smaller area, just because of perforations of verticals or heterogeneity of horizontals. And would there be different results if we were to run core floods with kind of fixed pressure drops, which is probably at some point in the reservoir, and depending on spacing and characteristics, what we might have, or at least be closer to reality? What would be your
So you do have a good point, and in any experiment, we always, no matter who you are, you have to be continually asking your question, the question of, do I have some kind of artifact? Is this really giving me solid, believable, useful information? And without being specific to the point you're making, that is true for any experiment that we do. We have to make sure that our experiment is not being misleading, and we have to make sure that we are doing a decent job of imitating what they're actually going to see in the field, right? So and that's something, I mean, throughout the whole history of polymer flooding, we continually do that. We see, okay, we made a mistake here, we need to do this experiment differently. So that's an evolving situation, and probably always will be an evolving situation. But as experimentalists, we always have to do that, and we have to be open to somebody saying, well, what if you did the experiment a different way? Would we get a radically different conclusion? So we always have to be open to that. So that's an excellent point. Right.
So no, for the next time, maybe what's your latest research? What have you been working on recently? I would say, let's say the last 6 months, for instance.
Well, let me divide that into a couple of different things. The thing that's maybe most immediate significance is, I guess it's been more than 6 months, it's been more like a year or two, is the realization or focusing on, especially at Milne Point, where I've been fortunate enough to do a fair amount of work. Milne Point is a significant polymer flood project, very exciting polymer flooding project on the North Slope of Alaska. And one of the things we saw, very unusual polymer retention behavior. And so we were fortunate, because it was a DOE sponsored project, to be able to pursue that and figure out why it was occurring. And a lot of it is because of illite, the clay illite that's up there. And the other thing of real significance is demonstrating very definitively that just putting a little bit of ATBS in the polyacrylamide radically reduces the polymer retention, which, a lot of operators don't necessarily see or appreciate. If somebody tells you about retention, it doesn't really sink in that, having a low retention, polymer retention or absorption on the rock can have a major economic benefit to you as opposed to having a high retention. So that's something maybe of most significance. That's more on the order of a year old. Something within the last year, which was a really fun project for me, was interacting with the Hillcorp people again at Milne Point on the facilities, and that was really a lot of a learning experience for me. So that was really fun, testing out, seeing the differences between different facility configurations and what worked best for them and what didn't work so well. In the laboratory, what I have been working on, again, this would be quite recent in the most recent 6 months, would be maybe something you might argue academic or not, depending on who you are and what you believe, is the effect of salinity and divalent ion concentration on rheology in porous media. And there are some real interesting surprises there that if we look at rheology of polyacrylamides or synthetic polymers in porous media, they show Newtonian behavior at super, super low velocities. They show shear thinning behavior at intermediate velocities. And then they transition into a shear thickening behavior where the apparent viscosity increases with increased velocity. And that's more thing that we associate with near wellbore type of region if you don't have fractures present. And then there's a mechanical degradation region. And there have been kind of some guesses and some speculation on what should happen as a function of salinity and hardness. And one of the things I've done is actually test that and pin it down. So that's been kind of fun and definitive. So that's what I've been doing most recently. Yeah.
So maybe a kind of question I'll try to ask to all the next, I would say, people I will have is injectivity test or pilot right away for polymer?
Well, there's different things you learn from an injectivity test. I mean, you learn things. I mean, an injectivity test is smaller. You do learn things about dissolution of your chosen polymer. You learn things, or you can. I mean, it depends on the person or the people who are doing it, but you can learn a lot about it from an injectivity test if you have interested people in there and looking at different things. Pilot right away, I suppose it depends on the confidence of what you have. So I guess I don't have a definitive particular answer to that. I mean, it could go either way depending on what you already know about your reservoir and the specific goals of your injectivity test or your pilot. One of the criticisms of a pilot usually are still expensive. And I've seen people spend a lot of money and time designing a pilot only to find fairly early on in the pilot that there was something really important that they missed. And maybe the management will said, well, you said this is what you're going to do, so you can't change. You gotta push ahead and do this pilot. And in that case, maybe doing the injectivity test in advance so that you get a better feel for designing that pilot better can be of benefit. So anyway,
so in that case, if you're going for injectivity test, how long to get enough information, steady state, and be sure that you are measuring something that's going to be of significance for your business case?
So that again, will depend very much on what you believe. I mean, we still have a lot of people out there who just absolutely do not believe in fractures. So if I've got a vertical well, even a horizontal well, but let's just say a vertical well, and some management is saying, I'm going to prove that, you will not go above the formation parting pressure. And okay, so now you got criteria for how you're judging whether you're going out above the parting pressure. Um, you got people who are doing pressure transient analysis. A lot of people with pressure transient analysis, they'll make a judgment that, well, this doesn't show any linear flow behavior with my pressure transient analysis. And what they don't realize is that pressure transient isn't measuring anything close to the well bore. That transient is happening, is fast enough that what you're really analyzing is way out in the reservoir, and you may still very well have a 10 or 20 or 30-foot long fracture, but you'd never see it in your pressure transient analysis because that's in the early time region and you're never seeing it. So my real point going back on this is, if any of these tests, whether it be a pilot or a injectivity test, is you got to decide what it is you're going to learn. So if let's say, I'm going to do this injectivity test and my goal is to prove that I'm staying below the part formation parting pressure. That's one goal. Another goal might be to say, all right, I know I'm going to go above the parting pressure. Maybe my goal is to try to do some tests to judge how long that fracture might be that's there. Maybe what direction that fracture is growing, right? Some people have tried to get polymer retention tests by a push-pull type of thing. Those are really quite difficult to do in that circumstance, but some people have done that. Just the learning process of maybe getting oxygen-free conditions, or even getting the silly polymer into solution, or what polymer source, what water source should I be using? A lot of just experience things like that. So again, everybody's maybe going to have a little different objective with each of these tests, whether it be a injectivity test or a pilot, and you got to make sure you've got those down the way you want it, and make sure you've got good logic in, is this test going to answer my question, right? So
it means you
I
have
don't.
to, you have to ask and pose the right question in the beginning, success criteria, and then the design everything to get the
Exactly. So
answer.
there isn't
Yeah.
necessarily a one size fits all on this. I mean, it's for your particular good conditions, just convincing yourself that you are learning the things that you really need to learn with that test. Yeah.
And maybe to conclude on this part, so is there anything you think is missing in the industry, or something you're excited about, or something you like to see happening or not happening? Who knows?
So there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that we have already in polymer flooding. So in terms of what's missing, I mean, if you're just some guy out there, operator, saying, well, polymer flooding sound interesting, coming up to speed enough to know what we've already learned can help you a lot, avoiding a lot of mistakes. So that's number one, is not just saying, what the heck, I'm going to do a polymer flood, but learning a little bit, enough about it so that you got a good feel for what you're doing. And the second thing I would definitely say is staying away from black magic. We still have way too much black magic out in this area. People saying when there's no fractures, when there obviously has to be, really bad concepts about, baby mobility ratio isn't important, things like that. Staying away from black magic is really important. We know a lot. Just make sure you learn about it enough so that you know what you're doing. That's a good start, and it can be, really profitable for people.
So leaving the technical aspects and going maybe to the industry trends and the future. So it seems like what you were saying at the time, even in the 80s, is EOR has had ups and downs, lows and highs. And even today, we still say primary, secondary, and tertiary. And so despite all the evidence, and maybe it's unclear, but it seems, as you were mentioning, like with Milne point, that it seems starting early with especially polymer flooding works better. So why has EOR been lagging all these years? What do you think?
Well, the number one thing is the cost effectiveness of the process. I mean, the people go into this, the big managers are always saying, am I going to make money off of this? And, with a lot of surfactant flooding or chemical flooding type processes, any kind of process, it becomes obvious. Well, there's the first question of what's the cost of what I have to inject versus what's the value of what I'm going to get? And that's a big question. So that's always going to be out there at the top. And like I say, a big reason why there's such high interest in polymer flooding is because polymer costs have stayed low, and our oil has a significant value to it. So that's, got to be very high up there in terms of what's attracting it. The other thing then, of course, is the operator understanding what any particular EOR method really can do and what it can't do. So a lot of these processes have a significant technical basis to them, and you have to get up enough on the technical basis so that you're doing the right things. And that's, everybody's busy and they've got a lot of different things to do, so learning the critical things you need to learn that's really important. Yeah.
And so why do you think it's been lagging? Because why we don't see more and more? I mean, we start to see more and more, but when you look at the history, there were a lot of projects in the US in the 70s for tax incentives. Then everyone basically quit until Dajing in 1996. Then you had again a kind of a hole in history. Then Marmul in 2010, and since 2010 it's been ramping up. But why these cycles? Is it just because everyone's following the price of the barrel, or is it trying to look for faster return on investment, better NPVs, lack of
Um,
knowledge at the time, or?
yeah, so all of those. I mean, historically, as you said, there was a lot of polymer flood applications in the United States in from 1980 to 1986, and they were 100% tax driven. I mean, there were a few really good projects, but vast majority of them were uh, people knew if they put in few teaspoons of polymer, they could radically reduce their taxes, and they were that period was horrible for polymer flooding and for chemical EOR because people didn't want to learn. All they wanted to do is get the tax incentive. So I would treat that one separately. Yeah, there was a lot done, but most of it was valueless. I mean, a few good projects certainly, but no more than a handful. And the rest of them were just, we wish they hadn't happened. Dacheng was a very bold thing by the Chinese, incredible value. I mean, it required some real insight and, not just following the crowd of taking the step out to do that. And of course, we've learned a tremendous amount from Dacheng. Pelican Lake, when Synovus started that and looking at that in 2003 type of time frame. Again, a big step out and realizing horizontal wells could have such an incredible impact. So, I mean, yeah, horizontal wells is a development that people realize we can go after some of these fairly thin zones with remarkably viscous oils. That's a big step for us. And you can't underestimate the value of the vendors keeping polyacrylamide costs, polymer costs low. I mean, we don't really emphasize that a lot, but that has had a major impact on us. So, and then little developments here and there, just getting more cost-effective polymers, little steps that we made. So, the hope is that we're increasingly doing it more correctly, realizing where it can be done well and have an important effect. Those are things that we're hoping it won't be as cyclic. Of course, it's always going to be somewhat cyclic, but at least getting people more comfortable that this really is a tool that under the right circumstances they can do very well with.
And so you are mentioning, of course, the importance of polymer vendors and the rest, but so how is important for you, how important is collaboration between universities, operators, chemical suppliers, and so, and can you share some examples of successful collaborations? Not
Yeah,
mentioning
so
maybe names, but at least saying how
uh,
important it is, and if you can give a couple of examples.
yeah, I don't mind mentioning names. The point is, information is really important power, right? I mean, if you do something right, you're gonna be wasting a lot of, or if you're gonna do it, get a lot of money out of it. If you do things wrong, you're wasting a lot of money. It's pretty much that simple. So, information is really valuable. An obvious, really successful collaboration is Milne Point, and this is a project on the North Slope of Alaska. It began the polymer flood in 2018. It was a collaboration between Hillcorp, which is the field operator, the Department of Energy, who provided a significant amount of funds for this, University of Alaska, who was kind of the lead academic organization on this, and then we had a number of other folks who got involved, including University of North Dakota, Missouri, and New Mexico Tech. And in thinking about the value of it, maybe Hillcorp could see that maybe polymer flooding really had some potential there, but like all operators, they're trying to get the most money for the least kind of investment, and the fact that they could get the DOE to kick in a certain amount of money to help pay for things and get things started, it had a major effect. It wouldn't have happened if the DOE hadn't kicked in this money, probably. So, and the bottom line on all this is Hillcorp, or the Milne Point, I think, is an incredibly valuable experiment, and it's really expanded field wide, which never would have happened if we hadn't started on this path. We're learning a lot. I think it has tremendous additional potential up there. Maybe not just at Milne Point, but in other fields in the area that have similarities to it. So, it's a major resource expansion for us. And again, it wouldn't happen probably if the DOE hadn't kicked in this. On the DOE side, the DOE they're very political animals, and these days they're all focused on CO2 sequestration and hydrogen. So it was a major effort for, you don't really think about politicians, but you got to give some credit to Lisa Murkowski, who's the senator up there, who said, look, we need to do this project. I know DOE, you wanted to spend all your money on CO2 sequestration, but this is an important project and we need to do it. So if she hadn't stepped in, the project probably never would have happened either. On the university side, it's really important for us to get the guidance from Hillcorp of, these are the problems that we're seeing and that we need to work on and to focus on. And, that gives us the incentive to go after things and to focus on things. If the DOE money wasn't there, probably Hillcorp wouldn't have spent the money to answer some of these critical questions. Critical questions that the university did end up answering was, number one, well, we mentioned this idea of the polymer retention, figuring out just the nature of polymer retention at the Milne Point field. We would have never known that without the ability to spend the money to do that. Everybody knows eventually with large volume polymer banks, you're going to be producing this polymer. If it's polyacrylamide, you probably, maybe a lot of times you're going to use a heat exchanger or heater treater to try to make the separation. A lot of people, Canadians in particular, other people, Indians have found out that you get this really nasty intractable gel if there's divalent cations around. And at Milne Point, we showed that, how to avoid that. It's a question of keeping the skin temperature below a certain level, 120 degrees centigrade in that particular case for that particular polyacrylamide. And it says we can make this work, right? And other people have since then have said, well, if you put some ATBS with that, you can raise that skin temperature higher. Incredibly valuable information that everybody benefits from and makes these projects easier to go. So, again, that's a case where collaboration, we've learned some super important things. Direction of fractures. LPAD pattern up there at Milne Point, horizontal wells are north-south, and not anywhere near as the issue with channeling between horizontal wells as you do if the fractures or the horizontal wells are east-west. That's the kind of thing you see that it's critically important to learn that. We learn other problems that need a solution to it yet. On horizontal wells, it's really going to be of high value to know where the polymer leaves the wellbore. So we need some kind of profiling tool that tells us where that, and for long horizontal wells, that's not easy, right? We need some developments in that area. So anyway, that's just kind of babbling on, showing that there are some really incredible benefits from the collaboration.
So very important to have inputs and funding, of course, to kickstart these things.
Yeah.
Well, we are approaching the end. So now that you have addressed pretty much the major aspects, what do you think will happen in the future? What do you see about maybe your next project about EOR? And last question is, what do you recommend if anyone wants to, a freshman, for instance, or a newly graduated engineer wants to start to dive into this EOR world? So what would be your recommendations? So reflections, future, and recommendations.
Yeah, the first thing is the future is unpredictable. I guess we've all found that out. So the thing, if you're just coming into this area, number one, read a lot, learn a lot, kind of pick up everything you can for what's happened in the past, get a good objective view of that. Be flexible. I mean, the opportunities that were given to me are very different than the opportunities given to you, to somebody else, right? And so you got to be flexible, and you have to be pragmatic about what your talents are and what your flaws might be. Be willing to listen to other people and maybe criticisms from other people, and ask, do they really have a point where maybe I could be making some improvements or doing something better, or are they just doing something to sell a product that doesn't really have any value? I mean, be pragmatic and open-minded on maximizing your own talents, I guess. And like I say, be flexible.
And stay away from black magic.
Yeah, definitely do that. Yeah, that's causes way too much problems for us. So yeah.
Oh, well, thanks a lot. And so we'll stay in touch for other videos where we'll probably dive deeper into other topics, including injectivity, simulation, retention, lab studies, and all some other details about polymer flooding and water shutoff conformance. And I think there is a lot to discuss. So with this, Randy,
really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a very great day, and talk soon.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.